Reconstructionist Radio presents a War Room production. The Postmil Report with Nathan F. Conkey.
Hello and welcome to the 49th edition of the Postmil Report with your host, Nathan Conkey. And I was accused of being looking like John Malkovich by a commentator last week. Oh dear, I hope not. Anyway, this week I want to look at strategies for growth in the heartlands of Christendom, the decadent heartlands, and also at the frontiers of Christendom. By the heartland, I mean Northern Ireland, and by the periphery, I mean Puebla, Mexico. But I think these places can be instances that can serve for parts of Europe and parts of America on the one hand, and Latin America, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on at the other. This is from my point of view and the point of view of my calling, which happens to be in education, and that has turned out to be language education, much to my surprise. Now, hopefully, just as Northern Ireland can stand for the rest of decadent Christendom, and Puebla can stand for the frontiers of Christendom, so perhaps this episode, with my specific focus on language, can be a cipher for your own specific calling. Now, what inspired me to focus on this was a friend request, the request of a friend, let's just say, who shall remain anonymous. His name is Ben, and he's studying languages in England. He asked for me to share a little bit about the interest in Christian education here in Puebla, and why contrast it with the decadent heartland of Christendom? Well, I've been thinking a lot about home for some strange reason, so I'd like to combine the two from my point of view. Anyway, so it's going to be very brief, I think, but hopefully it will give you lots of food for thought. What are the challenges? What's the overall situation in Puebla, Mexico, in terms of the institution of state, notably healthcare and education, the economy, and the growth of the churches? Well, as with so much of the developing world, or better, the fringes of Christendom, there is relatively little input from the civil government. Although in Mexico, you can see policemen most everywhere. The institutions of the state just aren't as strong as the richer areas of Christendom. And of course, this is normally a good thing. And Mexico, relative to other regions, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa, although Nigeria is an up-and-coming country, Mexico is still much richer with a much stronger central government. But as this plays out in healthcare, there is socialized healthcare here in Mexico, but people realize if you depend for your health upon the free health service, then you are indeed in dire straits. As with every socialized healthcare system, it is subject to great waiting lists, and of course, waiting lists kill. So what has happened? If you take a drive around Puebla, you'll see that many entrepreneurial individuals and larger companies, some from Mexico, some from north of the border, have set up clinics. There are clinics to test everything. There are clinics to cure everything, all dotted around Puebla. And I think one of the humorous aspects of the Mexicans is that they tend to be rather hypochondriacal, which is a great opportunity for those in the healthcare industry. But they've gone and they've created their own alternative, compared to Europe and the US and Canada, despite the relative poverty. So what about education? Well, there is obviously a public education system here in Mexico, but it ain't that good, and the people know it ain't that good. We have bright students arrive who literally don't know the alphabet in Spanish, and that is shocking. That makes me angry, of course. And parents aren't foolish. They don't have their eyes shut. Linked to this, the economy is growing thanks to globalization and other factors. There is a large, in fact, the largest car plant in the whole of the Americas is here in Puebla. Audi has recently opened another large car plant. And of course, there'll be all the industries, service industry, auto industry, and so on, employment agencies that assist and facilitate those big central employers. So that feeds into the whole education thing. People who can afford it, and frankly, people who can't afford it, sometimes the people who can least afford it, are spending their money, scraping and scrounging, to give their children a decent education, decent academically and decent morally, because the United States and the United Kingdom aren't the only two countries in the world who have an educracy, if that's a word, educational bureaucracy, which is very virulently anti-Christian. As I say, the economy is growing, but also the kingdom of God is growing. There are many, many more evangelical pastors than priests here in Mexico, which may surprise you. Of course, we know that the religion of Mexico is not by a long shot Catholicism. The true religion, the thing that guides people's lives more than anything, is secular humanism, and the great institution of the secular humanist state above all things. But at any rate, the church is growing. There is a demand. So with a weak state and weak and failing institutions of state, what do people do? Well, we've seen what people have done in the healthcare industry, and we've seen that parents are willing to spend money to give their children a decent, a good, a morally good, and academically good education. So the strategy here is, of course, to facilitate the creation of Christian schools. Just to give you an idea, ACE, Accelerated Christian Education, has 300 schools here in Mexico, which is not a vast number considering the population, but it is nevertheless only one Christian school curriculum provider, and that's not counting the home schools either. So the strategy is clearly to make Christian curriculum available to those that want it, to make schools available to those that want it. And what we're doing here in Puebla, Mexico with the Pierre Viret Learning Center is to do just that, to get the experience, to create the models, to build up the repertoire of talks, and just to gain the hands-on experience to be able to offer Christian schools. There are 2 people on our staff who are interested in starting their own Christian school, one from Tabasco, a province which is as hot as the hot sauce which bears its name, and the other is a native Poblana from Puebla. So we're working long term to get the experience, and also from my point of view, to create the curriculum necessary, the Spanish language curriculum that will prepare the children to be able to speak and listen and read and write in English. And in 3 years, I've made some strides towards doing that. So you should be encouraged that there is a demand here amongst Christians. The Christians here are often first-generation Christians, which is great, which is what happens when there is rapid church growth. And these Christians, they're not perfect by any manner of means, but what they do not have, which is a good thing, they do not have the inertia which Western Christians so often have. For 150 years or more, the humanists, the state, has been in charge of the schools. Christians have completely forgotten that once it was the Christian denominations and groups of Christians that provided for the education of Christian children. But here, there is no history of syncretism and compromise comparable to that in the West. So there's a golden opportunity. Perhaps you are terribly frustrated at your neighbour Christian, and the Christians in your country generally, at their failure to see the obvious, what's obvious to you, in their failure to provide a Christian education for their children. Doubtless you've invested in the education of your own children, perhaps in homeschool or Christian school. But if you want to spend time and resources and money in an area which has a growing desire for Christian education, the world is your oyster. Find out more about what's happening here. Perhaps you can invest in this project. Or, for a more general overview, you should read Philip Jenkins' book called The New Christendom, which will open your eyes to some of the needs and opportunities that abound in the developing world. So let's jump across the Atlantic Ocean. 1, 2, 3, jump. Jumping. And we touch down in Splash. It's raining. It must be Ireland. Yes. So what's the situation here in the old country, in the decadent, once was heartland, even though it's at the periphery of Europe, the heartland of Christianity? Well, in terms of the state is relatively stronger. And what's more, the people rather have a strong faith in the state, which seems to be less evident in my experience than here in Mexico. There is socialized healthcare, as is so common in Europe and perhaps will be common in the US after Trump gets kicked out, who knows. But that is very much in order. There are very, very few alternatives there in terms of clinics, private hospitals and so on. But it's interesting that there is a chink beginning to show in the armour. 2 of my family members, 3 of them actually, one of which used to work for the National Health Service. They are now seeing what would be called alternative medical practitioners for their very pressing medical needs. So there is a slow loss of faith in the institutions of the centralised state in terms of healthcare happening, and even amongst older, more conservative people. The institution of education is very much the 800-pound gorilla in the room. There are very, very few Christian schools in Ireland, Northern Ireland, which has overwhelmingly more evangelical Christians, better said, than the South, has much fewer proportionately Christian schools, which should tell you something. But the institutions, nevertheless, are strong in terms of healthcare and education. Healthcare, they're showing cracks. There is a fundamental problem at the heart of the National Health Service. The problem is that it's based on a system of theft, and God hates theft. But practically speaking, they have a centralising tendency, and the more things are centralised, the less efficient, the more unwieldy they become, and the more that shortages of staff, shortages of the ability to operate or treat or see people, shortages of beds will present themselves. And of course, the solution of a centralising system, which has effectively the state as its sovereign, is to centralise, which further compounds the problem. So there is a rather big tsunami wave gathering out somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, which one day will catastrophically hit. But in the meantime, hospitals slowly but surely are being closed, and the institution of state-controlled healthcare is crumbling. As regards the schools, the situation is rather parallel. There are very, very, very few Christian schools, as I've said, but the schools are crumbling, quite literally in some cases, and the solution to everything really is centralisation. And there are particular factors in Northern Ireland which mean that the freer schools, those that are freer to spend their budgets, freer to decide on policy and so on, generally freer from state control, are the ones that will be closed when the closures come, and the new schools that will be built upon the ashes of the old will be very much strictly controlled by the state. And with increased state control comes increased inefficiencies and an increased ability to do what they're supposed to do, which is educate, although that is another question as to whether that is really in fact their actual purpose. But at any rate, the state of the statist institutions are strong, relatively, but the foundations are radically being eroded away. Now, what to do in this situation? Well, I've been thinking about this, and I'm at the moment preparing a new version of my online curriculum. I've planned out 100 lessons so far. I believe there's probably around 100 to go, and lots of work to get that all together, perhaps a month or two. But at any rate, I will be releasing, God willing, a program that will take, hopefully, the Spanish speaker with very little English and bring them up to speed so that they'll be able to understand, for example, with a dictionary in hand, perhaps, a news article or or the such like. Now, as somebody with relatively little experience as a language teacher, only 3 years, perhaps a little bit more, who has limited formal training in Spanish, 0 really, and only a month's education in how to teach English, apart from the practical experience that I've had, can get together a course like that. Well, I'm confident that in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, I can begin to offer programs that will offer the parents and the students the ability to go from zero to median ability in French and Spanish, which will enable them to pass their state-controlled French exams or Spanish exams. Now, I believe that one person can do this, or a group of people can do this with the right amount of effort and focus and money and so on. But what I'm saying is that a strategy for a place which really at the moment doesn't want Christian education, doesn't want Christian schools, a strategy is, according to your particular calling as a teacher, as a Christian teacher, is to little by little take the responsibility upon your shoulders to prepare the children for fluency, relative fluency up to a certain standard in French or Spanish, or perhaps you have a background in maths, so the equivalent level in maths or English, or name your other subject, little by little taking control, knowing that, covenantally speaking, the institutions of state are in trouble. So it may not mean that in a few years that you'll be running a string of Christian schools or so on, but you'll be able to meet real needs in the marketplace and real demands with a covenant eye to the future. Now, this perhaps may not seem too dramatic or too earth-shattering, but I want to repeat the sort of underlining thinking behind that, and we'll see what you think. So, first of all, start with your calling. What is your calling? You've got to know your calling. If you don't know what your calling is, then take the time to work towards finding that. And that means working and finding what you're good at through work. It means maybe taking personality tests online. Maybe it means speaking to counsellors whose job that is. Maybe it is reading relevant books on the subject. But then once you find your calling, take the time to specialise in that calling, in that pursuit. That will mean, according to Malcolm Gladwell in the book Outliers, and this is as good a rule of thumb as any, it means 5 years working in that speciality to gain competence, and then a further 5 years of intense work focusing on mastering your calling to gain mastery of the subject. But it also means having a covenantal perspective. I can tell from conversations I've had with master teachers or very, very experienced school teachers back home, the specifics of why the schools are crumbling, why there will be such opportunities in the future. But underlying that, and more important than that, is a covenantal perspective. It's your faith. You always see the world and its specifics through the eyes of faith, through your actual religion. And the covenant states that there is no other foundation that can be laid except from Christ Jesus. And that means in the economy, that means in healthcare, that means in education, that means in every area of life. And the wicked will not prosper. The wicked that are aborting babies in healthcare and killing old people in healthcare by neglect, deliberate neglect, at the one hand, and in education, propagandizing children into the evils of homosexuality and lying to the children about the world, about God and about man. These institutions covenantally can't stand, but also covenantally we've been given a law that is a law for conquest. Deuteronomy was given as a book to prepare the children of Israel to conquer in the promised land. They were supposed to have conquered by heeding what they read in Exodus or heard in the book of Exodus, but of course they didn't. So we too have the Deuteronomy experience in front of us. One of the commands is to take possession of the land. The command is to break the idols. But the command very much is to work and work hard. And one of the injunctions also, and one of the warnings and counsels that God gave the conquering people of Israel in Deuteronomy was that he would not give the land to them all at once, less the land, and God has very much an interest in the land of Mexico and the land of Northern Ireland, and fill in the blanks, the land of even England, the land of Scotland, the land of Wales, the land of Ireland proper, and you can fill in your state or town or county or whatever it happens to be. God has plans for it. Anyway, little by little, in case the wild beasts destroy the land. And so too, we must have a perspective of little by little. Now, we all want to have overnight success. Overnight success would be great. But most overnight successes have been working 15 years or longer at being an overnight success. So have that perspective of little by little. And again, repeating the counsel of Mr. Yarborough is first the blade. We have the seed, and then pop, up through the ground pops the blade before the full-grown, mature ear. So we too should be looking around according to our calling, according to our knowledge of our region, our area, for areas in which we can serve and trying to serve there. But we can never hope to have chain of Christian schools if we can't first become a classroom teacher or find those that are classroom teachers. We can't hope to shoulder everything at once without going into training. As I've said before, we must admit that we as individuals are atrophied. Our muscles have grown weak and useless through lack of use. And we Christians in the West are just learning the lessons that have been forgotten by past generations. We're learning to shoulder the burdens that we have failed to shoulder before. So just to emphasize that we need to have a entrepreneurial as well as a perhaps traditional missions focus. We've seen that here in Puebla, Mexico, with the building of a furniture factory. And do pray for our furniture business, Legado Tech. Look it up on the web, look it up on Facebook, give it a good thumbs up there. And do pray for Roger and Marcy as they're up in Texas selling furniture. Pray that God would favor them. But as I think of my own native Ireland, if I'm going to serve in language teaching, I'm going to have to serve real people. I'm going to have to serve unbelievers. And this is part of our learning how to teach the nations. It's one aspect of it. Language learning, it's a necessary aspect for dominion taking, for the service of God. We will gradually see Christendom restored, not by the efforts of one person, but by the consecrated efforts of many people who find out what their calling is from God, who specialize and work at that calling, who have a covenantal perspective upon their place, whether there's church growth there or church decline there, and they will seek to serve in meet specific needs entrepreneurially about in their own area. So I'm very much learning. As I say, I've only 3 months of experience at most in classroom language teaching. I'm just moving. I have 3 months, in fact, of online teaching, even though that online teaching is done in the classroom. We need to take these baby steps and learn the ropes. And there's a long way ahead of me before I can reach my dreams. But I think we must have that perspective and take the time to do it. So I hope that was comprehensible or almost comprehensible. If it was, please tell me so. If it wasn't, please say, Nathan, I didn't understand a word you said. Please help me. But I hope you got a lot out of that. I hope that was somehow encouraging to you. If you're interested in supporting my work here in Puebla, Mexico, where I'm working on designing now online curriculum to teach Spanish speakers English so that they can get access to Christian curricula, wider Christian curricula, please go to cten.org/Nathan Conkey. I do appreciate your support. A big shout out to my supporters in Europe and Canada and America and wherever else you may lie. Big thank you. Thank you so much. If you want to get in touch, you can do so at facebook.com/Christian.education. So there you go. That's the end of the Postmil Report, episode 49. Have a great week. God bless. And talk to you next week, God willing.
Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network brings to you a complete lineup of podcasts where you will hear practical and tactical theology. Our desire is not simply that you consume our shows, but that you also live out your faith in every area of life. We can talk all day long about these things, but if we fail to put them into practice, then we fail as ambassadors of Jesus Christ, our King. Subscribe now to your favorite Reconstructionist Radio Podcast Network shows, or you can subscribe to the Reconstructionist Radio Master Feed, where all of the content we produce, including the audiobooks and audio articles, will pop up as soon as they are available. And don't forget to visit reconstructionistradio.com to volunteer as a narrator or to partner with this ministry financially. May the Holy Spirit stir you into action for Christ and His kingdom.